Welcome, everybody, to the Truthful Hope Podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Vazquez. Today, I would like to address the question, does the soul exist? And more specifically, is there scientific evidence for the soul? It's commonly held in neuroscience that the soul is nothing but a myth, and it's just the mind is nothing but the workings of the physical brain. But findings in science are actually challenging these assertions. So today I get to speak with Denyse O'Leary about a new book that she's co-authored with Dr. Michael Egner called The Immortal Mind, a Neurosurgeon's Case for the Existence of the Soul. Denyse is a freelance journalist based in Victoria, Canada. She specializes in faith and science issues. She's also a co-author of another book with another neuroscientist titled The Spiritual Brain, a Neuroscientist's Case for the Existence of the Soul. And she received her degree in honors English language and literature. She writes a ton over at mindmatters.ai, which I cannot recommend enough. It is an amazing resource, which is published by the Discovery Institute's Bradley Center and covers news and analysis at the intersection of artificial and natural intelligence. Denyse, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for jumping on.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, it's really an honor to have you. Just for our listeners, this is what the book looks like. It's a very nice blue here, The Immortal Mind. Again, a neurosurgeon's case for the existence of the soul. Just such a great read. You know, I'm still working through it because I really want to make sure I get all of it in my mind. But I have jumped around and I've been using it, at least the amazing scientific findings, for my master's thesis, which aims to show the evidence that humans are human souls made in the image of God, and the implications this has for abortion, particularly for how naturalism cannot explain such evidence while Christianity can. So this book is just filled with amazing resources. So I really want to thank you and Dr. Egner for taking the time to write this book here.
You're most welcome.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and jump right into the first question I have. So I really just want to know, how did you get involved in this project with, renowned neurosurgeon Dr. Michael Egner, who has done over 7,000 brain surgeries, which is wild to think of. How did you get involved in this project?
Well, it started a long time ago. I was at a science writers conference in 2005, and a prominent Canadian science journalist came up to me and said, "You've got to help me. I've got this project they want me to do, and it goes against everything I believe in." And, he was quite a prominent man, and he'd always been polite to me. Not everyone is, if you're not a materialist. And so I said, okay, it's my problem, it's not your problem. Just tell me what this issue is, because I strongly suspected that it wasn't anything illegal or immoral. It was just something he didn't agree with, but wouldn't be a problem for me. So it turned out there was this neuroscientist, not a doctor, but a scientist who studies the brain at the University of Montreal. And he was trying to get his PhD, and he was doing his PhD on spiritual experiences. And he'd somehow attracted the attention of a big American publisher who wanted a book on the topic. But he was trying to get his PhD, and English isn't his first language. So I said, fine, get your PhD. We'll get this book out too. So we did. The book was called The Spiritual Brain, a Neuroscientist's Case for the Existence of the Soul. Now, what I discovered doing research for the book is that many ideas that are taken to be the facts of science are simply the mantras of materialism. This happened again and again when I researched things. And so the book basically addressed a number of different topics around things like spiritual experiences, near-death experiences, and so forth. And it did quite well. In recent years, a number of academics posted to a site called academia.edu that they had read the book. and I would get a notice from that site. After there were a few hundred of these notices, I thought, well, all right, all these people want to advertise the fact that they read the book. That's interesting, isn't it? Anyway, the upshot was I was then editor of Mind Matters News, which you mentioned, and Michael Egnor was one of the writers. So I said to him, well, Mike, how about a book that is the neurosurgeon's case for the existence of the soul? And he jumped right in on it because exactly he had been thinking of something like that himself. And I said, well, I've worked on a book like this, so I can be your co-author. And that's what happened. But the good news is a lot has changed since then between the two books. There's much more openness in neuroscience to just talking about these things because, quite honestly, the materialist approach is not working the way they'd hope.
So can you define materialism for our listeners? Because my next question would be, why do you think scientists are against the conclusion, generally speaking, that the soul exists? They write it off as the possibility of an immaterial mind or soul is just rejected, it seems, without even looking at the evidence. And maybe this is changing now, but why do you think that is? And maybe explore materialism for our listeners.
Well, materialism is simply, in the context, the belief that the mind is simply what the brain does. Every aspect of the human being can be fully explained by material facts. It's not a belief you can directly refute because people will say, well, you only think that because of processes in your brain. But the trouble is, it starts to wear very thin when you actually try to apply it to what's happening in, say, neurosurgery or to accounts of near-death experiences.
That's really helpful. Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I'm exploring that. So it seems like they're writing off anything that goes against the materialistic view before even looking at the evidence, and that would be very biased, it seems to me. And instead, and this is what, we had Dr. Casey Luskin on a couple times now talking about intelligent design, and his big thing was we should, instead of presupposing a belief, we should follow the evidence where it leads. So the same thing should be done with the mind. And if the scientific evidence shows that an immortal mind or immaterial soul exists, then we should hold that conclusion. So it really seems like the most adequate explanation when you look at the scientific evidence, and that's what this book is all about. So that's really helpful.
Yes, well, Michael Egnor, as he'll tell you himself if he's on the podcast, started out more or less as an atheist, but he couldn't account for a number of things that happened in neurosurgery on the basis of the materialist atheism that he had simply supposed was true. For example, as you've read a fair bit of the book, although we are told that this part of the brain does this, that part of the brain does that, well, some people are walking around who only have half a brain, or their brains have been split in half to treat epilepsy, or the cerebellum is missing. And often you see doctors wouldn't know this, except for modern diagnostic methods that can actually look at the structure of the brain. That is, if that person had lived and died in the 18th century, nobody would have known that a large part of his brain was missing. Anybody could have told you why a human being couldn't live under those circumstances. But that's not what actually happens. So Mike began to realize he was dealing with something different from what he had expected or had been told to expect. Certainly different from what the textbooks told him.
So interesting. It's kind of like the split brain chapter. I think it might be one of the first chapters, if not the first chapter. Yeah, and it's really right out of the gate.
So,
Yeah, it's really good. It's right out the gate. Like, okay, that's a big title, The Immortal Mind, a neurosurgeon's case. Like that gets you hooked, and then you don't waste time. You're just like, here's the split brain experiments. This shows the immortal mind. And when I was reading that, I thought of J.P. Moreland. He's a philosopher. You probably know his work very well, and he's done a lot on the soul. And he said, I've read some of his work where he said, if you take out, let's say, 80% of someone's brain, you don't have, let's say, 20% of a person left. You have 100% of a person. People are not like physical objects as a chair is. We're very much different. We are a unity of identity. And so the question is, where's that grounded? And I think the answer is the immortal mind. So it's really good stuff.
well, of course, I should stop here and say brain injuries are real. And even a slight injury could have catastrophic consequences. But the amazing thing is, it's not what you would expect of a physical object.
Mm.
In the sense that, think of a physical object like a bridge. An engineer could tell you what'll happen if this strut becomes weakened. What'll happen if that arch becomes weakened by a certain proportion. You can work it all out. And if a bridge is collapsing, you could get some idea what must have happened. But with the brain, it doesn't appear to exactly work that way in so many cases that you can't make it a sort of natural law. And that's we're dealing with something very different in the relationship between the brain and the mind.
That's really good. Yeah, I think another part of it too is consciousness, right? You go into a lot about consciousness in the book, and a lot of materialists will say, "Oh, consciousness is just the workings of the physical brain." But brain states or mental states like consciousness, if they're physical, they can't be true or false any more than physical objects like a chair can be true or false. Yet we know that our mental states are indeed true or false. So what best explains that? And I just think that's a really good breakdown of the nature of consciousness.
Well, let me suggest something to you. There are no good theories of consciousness.
Mm.
There are many, many theories out there about how human consciousness is produced. None of them actually explain very much or work very well. Now, I'm not saying there never will be such a theory, only that the people who absolutely insist that the mind is simply what the brain does don't have a single consistent theory that explains that. They have 100 different theories trying to explain it, which I would say in science, when that's happening, it's a clue that you might be on the wrong track. Before Isaac Newton, there were dozens of theories of gravity, apparently. None of them worked very well. Then Newton did his work on equations about gravity, and suddenly it started to make sense. Now, that was a physical thing. I don't know if that would or could or will happen with human consciousness. I would be much more pessimistic about that. But my point is, rather, when a science is generating all kinds of conflicting theories, while insisting that it's in possession of a really important truth, I do think there's a need for a reality check.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. As I'm reading this book, I'm looking at all this evidence of the scientific evidence for the soul. I was curious, when thinking about our conversation, what is your, I want to say, favorite argument for the existence of the soul, or most convincing scientific evidence that you've come across?
Well, favorite argument would be something that Augustine reported in the 4th century AD. Convincing evidence would be veridical near-death experiences. But, okay, let me start with favorite argument. Augustine wrote a letter to another priest. He was at that time a priest and became a bishop. Okay, in the early church. And he was relating the case of a doctor who didn't believe in the soul. He said, how can there be a soul? The doctor said, when a person dies, that person can't see or hear or feel anything. Well, the doctor was a very good doctor, very generous with poor patients and things like that. So Augustine writes that he felt that God tried to help that doctor understand better. So the doctor had a dream. And in the dream, a young man appears to him. And he takes him and shows him a city that may be the celestial city. I don't know. But he says to the young man, you're seeing me. How are you seeing me? And the doctor says, well, with my eyes. And the young man says, well, your eyes are shut fast in sleep. Are you hearing me? Yes, he was hearing him. Well, how are you hearing me? Your ears are insensible to anything. You're asleep. So anyway, the next night the young man came back and the conversation continued. But first the young man said, do you recognize me? And the doctor, Gennadius was his name, said, of course I recognized you. And the young man said, how was that? Where have you seen me? Well, in a dream. So then the young man said, don't fall into the trap of believing that when you are separated from your senses, you will not have any awareness at all. You see how false that is, even from this dream.
Wow.
Now, some believe that the young man was actually an angel. I wouldn't press the point, but I'm sure it was a true vision in the strict sense that the Lord was trying to get something across to that doctor, that there was something illogical about his belief that he had to be in possession of his senses to have those kinds of ideas, when it actually happened that he could have a very clear conversation with someone without any sensory input at all. So that's my favorite example, just to get people thinking. Why do you suppose that death is the end? If you mean because your body isn't doing anything, well, then how do you account for things like one of those vivid dreams? Okay, now, with near-death experiences, there's a very interesting class of experiences where the individual reports something, and it turns out, something in the physical world that he says he saw while separated from his body. And remember, in a modern intensive care unit, it might be known that that person was clinically dead. But they decide, okay, we'll try one last time and see if we can pull, because there is a window of opportunity sometimes when someone is clinically dead, if it hasn't gone on too long, so that brain damage is set in. There may be a window to shock the person back to life, right? Or do something that makes a difference. Okay, so during that period, some people say they felt they'd left their body and were floating. They see something and report it. And it turns out to be true. My favorite example was related by a psychiatrist who wrote a book about near-death experiences. He first got interested because he was attending to a suicide, a woman who'd failed in her attempt to commit suicide, right? But she'd had a near-death experience while she was in a very bad state. And when she saw him again, she said, you had a spaghetti stain on your tie. Well, this was true. That Dr. Bruce Grayson is his name, and he wrote the book After, if anybody wants to look it up. He had been trying to conceal the spaghetti stain from colleagues. but she had apparently seen it during the near-death experience. That got him thinking that maybe he shouldn't just write off near-death experiences as fantasies or something like that. Because remember, not only was this something in the physical world that she would have noticed, but it was something he'd been trying to conceal. And there are no such stories. So I would say to the materialist, okay, I'll listen, but I want you to account for that element of near-death experiences. Now, I personally think that the best explanation is that the human mind can survive separated from the body. We can call that the soul if you want. Although traditionally, the traditional Christian idea of the soul was that the human soul had two aspects. One is material and one is immaterial. The material aspect of the soul is what makes us physically alive. To picture this, picture the difference between a live cat and a dead cat. It's exactly the same cat before and after he had a massive heart attack. But there's a huge difference that everybody can see. Now that's the mortal soul. It's everything that makes a life form alive. And humans share that with cats and dogs. But we also have an immortal soul. And the immortal soul is what, separated from the body, spotted the spaghetti stain on Dr. Grayson's tie. So I think that that's mainly what near-death experiences show. Personally, I'm cautious about trying to derive theology from near-death experiences. I think that's where we have to be a bit careful. Some things won't surprise us. For example, people who have attempted suicide often have disturbing near-death experiences. But then that would be consistent with things that drove them to attempt suicide. The really interesting thing is, according to counselors who deal with them, they rarely attempt suicide again. Which, the reason that's significant is that the single best predictor of a successful suicide attempt is a number of previous ones. So if somebody simply stops attempting suicide, that's different from the usual prediction one might make, that that individual would attempt it again. And the person who has a near-death experience does not typically attempt it again. So something happened there that really changed that person's thinking. Possibly, at the very minimum, he realizes that suicide is not going to separate him from existence. There's no escape by that route. He's going to have to deal with his existence.
Yeah, that's, near-death experiences, NDEs, are just so amazing to me. And I'll be very honest, when I first heard, and I'm a Christian, when I first heard them, I was like, okay, sure, that sounds a little too good to be true. But then I started, reading this book and the work of Moreland, and especially Habermas, Gary Habermas, and the veridical accounts, the accounts that just are shown to be authentic by sources that just can't otherwise be used. It's just so, like that Thai story that you gave. For another example of story that is one of my favorites, and maybe you could give the details better than I can, but of blind people being born blind, having near-death experiences, seeing. Do you remember one of those stories from your book? Can you recount one of those? Because to me, that was just amazing.
Blind sight.
Yeah.
Well, they can. That's true. But then, if we go back to Augustine's account of Dr. Gennadius's dream, that was the point that was made to him. He could see the young man who was asking him some fairly pointed questions, how could he see them? His eyes were closed. Well, I imagine it's the same thing with the person who is physically blind in this world, but apparently there is a form of sight that the mind has. Call it mind sight if you want. One thing that might help us as Christians to deal with near-death experiences without going into any kind of woo, right? Would be to keep in mind that the reason they came to so much attention today was actually modern medical practice. See, now, near-death experiences were quite commonly reported throughout human history. The problem was, how do you know that person was dead? Well, you see, the modern intensive care unit will give you feedback from a body, including flat brainwaves. When the brainwaves are flat, basically nothing is happening in the brain. If the person comes back and says, I had a near-death experience, I was floating, I noticed that the nurse left my dentures in a drawer, but I don't seem to have them. Can you go and find them? And sure enough, they're in the drawer. Well, you see, for all I know, a similar story could have been told in the Middle Ages, but what they didn't have was the flat brainwaves. So what's really interesting to me is doctors studying near-death experiences, medical papers being published on them. So that is, in a sense, a blow to a materialist approach, because the materialist can just say, oh, that's hogwash. Fine. Then Dr. Smith and Dr. Jones and Dr. Phillips and Dr. Tate, the four authors of the paper, they're all talking hogwash, but the paper was published in a respected journal. Okay, whatever you say, sir, right? I mean, I'm just saying, if you think it isn't changing, something really interesting. I don't know, have you ever heard of a guy named Michael Shermer?
Yeah. The Skeptic magazine, I think he runs.
Yeah, well-known skeptic and debunker. Well, he had Michael Egnor on his show, along with a prominent neuroscientist named Christoph Koch. But it was a very respectful discussion. Nobody tried to make fun of Mike, because they knew perfectly well that there has to be some accounting for this sort of thing that goes beyond that's just hogwash. Now, I can't prove that they will or won't come up with a plausible materialist explanation. I don't see how, but then I don't claim to see everything either. All I'm going to say is it's not like it used to be, where people could just say, oh, that's nonsense, because there are too many things that they then have to account for that go beyond what you can. Like at one time, near-death experiences were the sort of thing like seances and mediums, right? And you could just say, oh, that's nonsense. Okay, I don't know. But the veridical near-death experiences, also the tendency of such experiences to cause people to make significant changes in their lives. Again, change isn't easy. Everyone knows that. If it's happening, there should be some explanation for it that goes beyond, it just so happened that way, or something like, and I think that's the problem that the one-dimensional skeptic is encountering. I mean, I try to be a skeptic too, but I try not to be a one-dimensional skeptic.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And that's a great segue to my next question is, given your journalistic background, Which I love, by the way, that you and Dr. Agner, right? You have the journalistic background, he has the scientific, and together you really put together a really good project in this book. Now, given your background, how are the skeptics responding to such an argument? Let's say, you said your favorite argument for the soul is something like NDEs. How are these materialists responding to those? Are they just saying, are they trying to, put it under the rug, or are they actually giving an account for what this is all about?
Well, one approach has been to point out that death occurs in stages. This, of course, is true. So what they're trying to say is that the near-death experience is simply the body's reaction to impending death. I don't think that works with veridical near-death experiences. I think they're going to have to eventually come to terms with the fact that the human mind can survive separated from the body, which no materialist will like. But it's not theology. Now, here's the problem that you run into when you try to bring in theology. Here's what I don't know. And by the way, for the record, I'm an observant Catholic. But what I don't know is what happens when the body disintegrates. I believe that the soul returns to God who made it. That's a statement of faith. It's not implicit in the near-death experience, because the near-death experience happens to the person whose body is technically dead, in the strict sense that if the emergency room team filed out of the room after unhooking everything, that person would be dead. But sometimes with modern methods can be brought back, right? But I don't know what the state of the mind would be 3 days later, when the body has been processed through the morgue and is in the funeral parlor. Now, I believe, for reasons not related to near-death experiences, that the human mind is immortal. But you'll notice that in the book, we make that case after we talk about near-death experiences. We don't use near-death experiences to directly make the case for immortality of the soul. What we say is that it shows that the mind can survive while separated from the body. Therefore, the mind is not simply what the brain does. But
Yeah, it's almost like, the cosmological argument, like saying that God, there had to have been a beginner of the universe. That doesn't show that the Christian God or the Christian view of God is correct, but it does show that there's a creator and a designer. So it doesn't have to prove too much. And I think the same thing with NDEs, the temptation, especially with the accounts of these visions, is to specify, the theological implication of these, which maybe a great amount of work can be done on that. But to your point, I think it at least shows that materialism is not adequate, or it really brings a big problem to their table. And you brought up how they brought up stages of death. I wonder how that even begins to account for the types of veridical experiences that these people are having, like, blind people seeing, or people seeing the spaghetti mark on the person's tie. Like, in any stage of death, I can't imagine that being possible. So it's tough to reconcile with, it seems.
well, one awkward problem with using near-death experiences to validate theology is people who were raised in different traditions have near-death experiences that appear to validate their tradition, which you might expect. The way I try to see it, and this is just my own view, okay, is when the mind is separated from the body, it's separated from all the information that our senses give us. All the information from inside, all the information from outside. It's gone. So that's just your mind. The concepts you have. If your concept of what lies beyond is a Christian one, you might see one thing. If your concept was a Buddhist one, you might see something else. Now, the fact that the person sees that does not validate that concept. Because what it is the immortal mind's concepts now rule. Now, I'm not saying that people might not get true information from a near-death experience. I believe they do. Sometimes people who have attempted suicide are told, don't do that anymore. Maybe one could say, oh, but he knew he was doing wrong. Okay, I don't know. All I'm saying is, I'm not saying it's all fantasy by any means. I'm just saying I would be cautious about attempting to validate truths generally through the reports of near-death experiences, because, for one thing, everybody who has a near-death experience comes back and reports it, or else we don't hear about it. We only hear from the people who came back. Now, it seems to me that I would assume that the Almighty knows whether people are going to come back or not. Sometimes they're told they have to go back, or that they ought to. Rarely do they want to, but they're told that they have to or want, and so I guess I just wanted to get across that because someone has a vision in which he sees something, doesn't mean that one should add it to one's theology. He sees that in part because it was a concept in his mind. But he may in fact get true information. Maybe his guardian angel appears to him and says, straighten out your life. And having come back, he does. And I'm not going to say that wasn't a true vision. I would look to see whether he straightened out his life or not. The best evidence for it being a true vision, given that I have no other, is that he did straighten out his life. I mean, a lot of people don't. Let's put it like that. So, so again, I think there's a lot we can learn from near-death experiences, but one way to avoid getting caught up in something unhealthy from a Christian perspective is to keep that element of the story in mind. This is a mind separated from the body. It is not necessarily a channel of absolute divine truth. There are probably truths in there, but we must sift.
Right.
I mean, that would be my personal approach.
I think that's good. You don't want to draw too much from the scientific evidence that we're seeing. You want to do theology in theology grounds. I think it's the best way to put it. Like, if you want to do theological work on these NDEs, take the time and do the work, but it's going to be a lot, case by case, experience by experience. It's going to take a lot of work. And I think we're just now, NDEs have been around for some time, but I think to your point earlier, you said just now the conversation is finally opening up in the field of skeptics, where they're actually willing to have this conversation. That's a major win. So keep it where it is, that it shows that materialism is problematic. And then once we get over that hurdle, maybe more and more work can be done to draw out the theology and whatnot. So I love that conservative approach to NDEs. Now, I want to also ask, I want to jump a little bit over to consciousness. Because consciousness is so amazing to me. What are the skeptics saying about consciousness? How are they explaining that from a materialistic point of view?
Well, usually there are theories about how consciousness is produced in the brain. There's something called global neuronal workspace theory, according to which there's a workspace to which various neurons contribute. Christoph Koch's theory is integrated information theory. Mike would be able to say more about that. It's currently the most popular theory, but it has to do with the integration of sources of information from many different neurons. The trouble is, at the end of the day, I don't know what it does explain about consciousness. I can tell you about a very interesting wager. Scientists sometimes do wagers. In this case, David Chalmers, a philosopher of mind, bet Christoph Koch a case of fine wine that in the next 25 years, they would not find a consciousness spot in the brain. Koch said, yes, we will find a consciousness spot in the brain. The wager started in 1998 and concluded in 2023. They had not found a consciousness spot in the brain or anything like it. Anyway, Chalmers appeared on stage having won the case of fine wine and gave a bottle to Koch and said, look, no hard feelings, and I'm certainly not discouraging you from research. It's just we need to focus our research on acceptance of some realities. So there they are, drinking the wine and having a good time because it was a friendly bet. Bets in science are supposed to be friendly. We'll see whether this happens or not. But anyway, then what happened later was Koch was the subject of a cancel letter signed by 123 neuroscientists attacking him and his theory. This happened, I think, in September of that year. I wrote about it last year. And the reason was that the neuroscientists were upset because they said, if his theory is correct, there's a problem with abortion. Because, you see, that might imply that unborn children are conscious. Okay, well, maybe it would, right? But rather than rethink their approach to abortion, they wanted to cancel him. So we actually felt badly for Koch, right? Because it wasn't, it was kind of an unfair assault, and in my view, very unbecoming on the part of scientists to do things like that and talk about revealing an agenda. But anyway, so you see, sometimes this field can be very lively. But no, they're nowhere near understanding consciousness, if it can even be understood on those terms.
Yeah, and that's actually my next question. It goes right into it. The most common objection that follows up to that, especially with consciousness and things of this sort, is, oh, well, the science will eventually figure it out. It'll explain it eventually. So no need to, posit a soul or God or any of that nonsense, they'll say. How would you respond to this argument that science will eventually just figure it out?
Well, I would start by asking, what is it that they're trying to figure out? The one thing everybody knows about for sure, you know about your own consciousness, I know about my own consciousness. You can doubt everything else. Your viewers and listeners are entitled to believe, if they wish, that I'm an avatar, that I don't really exist. How can you prove it? What proof would you accept? But none of them can doubt the consciousness by which they would be contemplating that. So now, how consciousness is produced, again, we may learn some things about that. my hope is that studies in these areas will help with the growing problem of dementia. As people live longer, the number of people who outlive the best days of their minds is growing too. And I would personally, honestly suggest focusing on things like that and less on the concepts like what is consciousness. Because we all know it when we see it, or when we experience it. We think we know it when we see it. When somebody is losing her ability to communicate with the world and understand things, is there anything we can do to help? It turns out there are some things we can do to help. But I worry that the focus will not be on things like that are of practical value, but more efforts to prove that consciousness is just this or just that or just something else. I would just suggest that the focus should be on something more practical.
Right. It's almost like the intelligent design evolution conversation. You know, if you treat people as just a collection of random molecules bouncing off one another and there's no rhyme or reason to it, then you're going to treat them like that practically, or at least if you're being consistent. But if you're treating them like a designed product that was made by the ultimate designer, the way you go about treating and researching and studying them enhances immensely, I think, right off the bat. And I know this Casey Luskinez has brought this up before too. Like, it changes the scope in which we do ethics and biology and research when you start with the premise that human beings are intelligent designed rather than an accident of nature. So I think the same thing goes for the mind, like you said, with dementia patients and other degenerative diseases. The way we go about treating them could be improved greatly if we understand and go with the premise that they are minds, not just matter. Now, the last question I have for you, this is the last one, because I think this is more of a practical, all of our questions are being segued into perfectly here. For a person listening who maybe haven't thought too deeply about the soul, and let's just say they've been indoctrinated in a materialistic naturalism worldview, in that all that exists is natural and physical matter, no supernatural, no immaterial. What would you say to this person to at least get them thinking about the soul more seriously?
Well, I would start, I suppose, by asking, how do you know you exist? What is it that knows you exist? It's not your brain. I mean, you can think it's your brain, but wait, how is your brain different from your hand? Does your hand know you exist? What material object, seen as such, knows that it exists? Now, someone might say, oh, well, a dog isn't a human being and he knows he exists. Yes, that's true. To whatever extent a dog has a mind, he knows he exists, right? Sure. Does a sand dollar know that it exists? I'm not sure. Maybe there is nothing that it is like to be a sand dollar. Maybe there's nothing that it is like to be a mushroom. But if you know you exist, you must know that there is something that isn't material, because your knowing that you exist is not material.
Wow, that's really good. It goes back to the whole, physical objects don't have any true or false beliefs, but we do. So what does that mean off the jump? It means most likely we're not 100% physical. Are we physical in some capacity? Of course. We have like you said, our hands, our bodies, but there's a different aspect to us that makes us hold true or false beliefs. And, for our listeners, again, that's what you get in this book. You get The Immortal Mind, a neurosurgeon's case for the existence of the soul. It's, if you like studying the soul like I do and philosophy of mind, you've read the philosophy of it, the theology of it, but this is really great because it's the scientific evidence. And I think it's what people are kind of yearning for. At least it's what the critics will ask for. So if you really want to get an idea of the soul, by the way, don't let the title scare you. It is understandable. It is down to layman's terms. You could understand it. Split brain research, you'll be a pro when you just read the first chapter, I promise. So, Denyse, I'm just so thankful for you and your work and Dr. Egnor and his work, and I'm really grateful that you came on the show. Thank you so much for joining.
I much enjoyed being here. Thank you for the opportunity.
Of course. Well, to our listeners, thank you for tuning in, and God bless.